The Reverse Flash is one of the best supervillains in all of superhero history, and is Flash's most iconic villain by a long shot, and is definitely the biggest menace in all of fiction. When you look at the definition of hater, Reverse Flash is what comes up. Reverse Flash will put his own life on the line just to make sure Flash doesn't have an ounce of happiness in his life. Reverse Flash will literally survive through a gunshot through the brain just so he can exist long enough to ruin the Flash's life one last time. That is the type of D1 hating Reverse Flash is at. Like, Reverse Flash's hater roar is so insane that every image you see of Reverse Flash, you can just tell he's planning something so devious. Like, I know Reverse Flash is just itching to do something devious the moment he can to Flash. Reverse Flash's beef is so generational, Reverse Flash cannot die unless Flash dies. So that means Reverse Flash makes sure to take Flash to the edge of death, but never go through with it, so since he can't kill him, he will just make him suffer instead, which might be a fate worse than death. But even though we all know how much of a menace Reverse Flash can be, I still don't think we have seen the full extent of just how much of a menace Reverse Flash can be, because there might be a Reverse Flash that might be the biggest menace out of all of the Reverse Flashes. Because recently, the new Absoulte Flash just came out, and it's an amazing retelling of how Flash gets his superpowers, and this Flash gets super speed at a young age, with this Flash being Wally West, instead of the Barry Allen you guys might all know as the Flash, which you guys might know as Wally West being the Kid Flash, and eventually becomes the mainline Flash in comics and in iconic TV shows like Justice League Unlimited. And in my opinion, Wally West is the best version of the Flash, even better than Barry Allen. And in this new Absoulte story, they show that having super speed in your teenage years is probably the worst superpowers you can ever get, since we all know how crazy powerful super speed can be, because this Wally West Flash is tweaking every time his Flash powers activate, and is one of the coolest versions of super speed in hero history, to portray super speed being more of a curse rather than being a gift like how it usually is. And if you guys don't know what the Absoulte Universe is, it's pretty much a new thing DC has started where they take iconic DC superheroes and amp them up to extreme by taking away something integral to the character, like the one most people know about, which is Absoulte Batman, which is a version of Batman who didn't grow up rich and had to become 10 times stronger and way more brutal to make up for not having all his cool gadgets. And this version of Absoulte Batman is facing villains that are even more of a bigger threat than his mainline villains that we usually see in movies, TV shows, and in comics. Like, recently we just got a sneak peek of what Absolute Mr. Freeze is gonna look like, and he looks like an absolute menace and pure nightmare fuel.
What? We're flying to Philadelphia! Oh, hell no! That's hell no!
Absoulte Batman is fighting Lovecraftian enemies that look like literal Wendigos in this Absoulte universe. And since DC is creating these Absoulte versions of superheroes and is also creating Absoulte versions of supervillains, I think it would only make sense to see an Absoulte Reverse Flash. After all, he is Flash's most iconic villain. Now, just thinking of what an Absoulte Flash could look like is just pure nightmare fuel that would give nightmares. So I wanted to see what an Absoulte Flash could look like in the Absoulte universe, and we might see that in the future for all I know. For all I know, he could be the literal cause to Barry Allen's death in this Absoulte universe. I wouldn't be surprised. But I wanted to create my own personal concept of what an Absoulte Reverse Flash could look like if he was given an Absoulte version, where this version of Absoulte Flash would be even more of a menace. And I think I have come up with a pretty cool idea for what an Absoulte Reverse Flash could look like. First off, if you're unfamiliar with Reverse Flash and his origin, I will give you a brief explanation to see how we can adjust it for this Absoulte universe. The origin of a Reverse Flash is pretty much he's a man named Eobard Thawne from the future who is a huge fan of the Flash and studied the Flash for most of his life, until he found out one day in the Flash Museum that he was destined to become Flash's greatest enemy and made him go insane. So the Reverse Flash eventually embraced being the enemy of the Flash and replicated the accident to give himself the Flash's powers, and goes back in time to embrace his destiny and become Flash's greatest enemy. And since the Reverse Flash is only created because Flash exists in the past, he is in sort of a time paradox where he can't kill the Flash, because if he does, he wouldn't exist to become the Reverse Flash. So instead of killing the Flash, he torments him and makes his life as horrible as possible. So pretty much how the Reverse Flash torments the Flash's life, he pretty much does devious acts like taking out his mom, pushing Flash down the stairs at a young age, making sure Flash doesn't have any friends at a young age, and if Flash somehow gets a friend, he will literally wipe them out of existence, which is insane level of hating. And if there were supposed to be an absolute version of Reverse Flash, we would have to tweak his backstory a little bit so that he can be a bigger menace against the Flash. Flash, and also tweak his backstory so that his hate will be more directed to Wally West's Flash, which is the person Absolute Flash is, instead of Barry Allen's Flash, which is the Flash that Reverse Flash usually has a beef towards. So how I would adjust this backstory for Reverse Flash for the new Absolute universe would be that his new backstory would be that Absolute Reverse Flash actually resents Wally West for killing Barry Allen's Flash in this Absolute universe. Because in this Absolute universe, Wally West is kind of responsible for Barry Allen's death, or at least he believes he's responsible for it. So this new Absolute Reverse Flash backstory would be that in the future, Hero Bart Thawne grew up poor instead of middle class or even high class like he usually tends to be in the future versions. Because in this Absolute timeline, his great descendants were actually in the same city where the Flash accident happened in the Absolute timeline that gave Absolute Flash his super speed. And since they were in the same town, during this top secret incident, they were blacklisted from every government job, had to sign NDAs to never speak about what happened in that small town. And since they were government workers, they had literally no job to go to, and their careers were ruined. And since their home was in that town, they lost their house during the Flash accident that destroyed that town. So Reverse Flash's family lived in poverty partially due to the Flash accident, and Reverse Flash sees Flash as the sole reason for living his life in poverty, and has dedicated his life to finding a way to get back at Absolute Flash. And since Reverse Flash lives in poverty, he has faced rough times and sees all the struggle he faces in life as Flash's fault, and as the sole reason to all of his problems. Even though the Flash isn't alive, he continues to hate Absolute Flash and dedicates his life to find a way to get back at Absolute Flash. So Absolute Reverse Flash dedicates his life to figuring out a way to go back in time and being prepared to ruin this Flash's life. So he works out so much so that when he finds a way to go back in time, he's a better fighter and is better in every way compared to Absolute Flash. So since birth, Absolute Reverse Flash has had this hatred towards the Flash, and this hatred drives his life and uses his existence as his sole motivator. So this Flash would be double the size because of how much he trained to eventually fight the Flash, and be trained in every fighting style with master level prep time. So when he faces the Flash, definitely not underprepared. And when this Reverse Flash is finally prepared and is super strong and studied every weakness of the Flash, he then replicates the accident that gave the Flash powers so that he could give that powers to himself and go back in time and carry out his plan. But when the Reverse Flash recreates the accident, he does it in his house because he doesn't have any money for a lab, and his mom happens to be there when he least expects it and dies when the lightning strike hits that rod and gives Reverse Flash his powers. And even though Reverse Flash was the reason for the death of his mom because of doing it inside their house and putting his mom's life at risk, he doesn't view it as his fault, but instead sees it as the fault of the Flash because he is the reason he did the experiment in the first place. Kind of like how Powerplex sees Invincible for everything going wrong in his life, that's how the Reverse Flash reviews every wrongdoing that happened in his life. But once Absolute Reverse Flash gets his powers, he goes back in time to save his family from poverty before defeating the Flash, but realizes that if he steals money and gives it to his family, it would alter history so that he wouldn't exist. And the Absolute Reverse Flash is livid that he can't live with the fact that he can't go back in time to save himself from poverty. So since this Absolute Reverse Flash can't make himself rich, he decides to make Absolute Flash's life a living hell because he has nothing left to do in the past but make Absolute Flash's life horrible since he can't help himself, which gives this Reverse Flash even bigger reason to hate on the Flash, even though it might not be entirely his fault. But that is just my pitch for what an Absolute Reverse Flash could look like. Reverse Flash is a character that is the biggest menace in all of fiction, so making him a bigger menace seems to be an insane concept. So I think giving him a bigger reason to hate the Flash would increase his hatred even more, since in usual stories he doesn't really have the strongest reason to hate the Flash, which might actually make him a bigger hater than this Absolute version, because the regular Reverse Flash just hates the Flash for the love of the game. But that is just what I think Absolute Reverse Flash could look like. Let me know down in the comments what you guys thought of my pitch. Let me know what you guys think of the Reverse Flash in general. He is personally one of my favorite villains, and if they ever give him an Absolute version, it would literally go insane. And let me know down in the comments what you guys think your Absolute Reverse Flash could look like, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see more videos like this, and I hope to see you guys next time. Later, hater. Peace.
If that's not the way to